Welcome back, everyone. For the second half of Cyber Talk with Nikolay regarding cyber insurance, we have our guest, Paul Kalatayud, organization ONDA, and we continue our conversation of the excitement and in cyber insurance industry. So I think while you were talking and describing all that your company is doing, it's kind of very interesting and very pertinent. And one thought came to mind: how, let's say, if somebody how would the practitioners like myself, CISOs, it seems like you do a lot of things for verification and ensuring the controls are working. And that's also the same question whether people buying insurance or not. Like I'm asking myself the same questions. Like I put all those controls in place. Do they really work? Or how would I create some ecosystem that I continuously monitor, make sure that controls are working and they deliver what they're supposed to deliver, and somebody didn't put something in place that how would you see this one, or would it be possible in some way to leverage for information security professionals, let's say when they go through this exercise of getting cyber insurance, to have this additional benefits like, hey, that's pretty cool. I'm getting insurance plus I also getting few things that will help me to understand better how my environment looks like and how can I actually continuously drive improvements in my organization.
I do feel like it becomes right now. It's not an expectation. The relationships I think between a CISO and an insurance, underwriter or broker or whoever they may be interacting with, very transactional. It's a bit even on guard, right? It's like someone's asking you how your program is, and you're trying to give as much minimum information as possible, kind of like you're treating it like an audit. And in this case, I think there is an opportunity to really change the dynamic of the relationship and how this interaction, because at the end of the day a customer's paying for a policy. Like in healthcare, we've seen similar trends. you know my healthcare provider can simply be there when I need an emergency procedure, and I pay for that insurance for that coverage, or they can start to really lean into the patient or potential patient and say, how do we avoid you going into the emergency room? What type of health memberships do you have? Like all these kind of wellness programs are starting to, it's a mutually aligned situation, because of course, the more healthier you are, the less likely you're going to be in the hospital and doing the bigger procedures, right? So that the claims aren't going to be as material. But at the end of the day, you're a healthier person, and so you kind of want that benefit, and you maybe need that little wellness coach giving you a bit of a nudge. And I think of that as a similar analogy to what I think we need to do with cyber insurance, is move away from being, in a situation where we're trying to determine whether or not we pay out a claim, on whether or not they did the right things, when we didn't actually assist them along the path, in terms of like, hey, you're in the emergency room now, so now what, right? And so I think CISOs definitely have a strong aptitude to have some of that trusted advisory and objectivity in their relationship. And because of the nature of the fact that we are already in relationship transactionally in terms of a policy, it's not necessarily too difficult to create an incremental value proposition that says, hey, now that I understand what's happening and I've assessed you, here's some things I think you need to change. And it's up to you to necessarily change it, but we think that if you do this and this, you're actually more likely to avoid a breach. And I think that's an important conversation to have versus one where we talk about the likelihood of a claim or the likelihood of a breach. I'd rather have claims avoidances that, more importantly, from a CISO's perspective, become breach avoidances. Because even if I do pay out a claim, or a CISO has to pay out a claim, it really does. That's like not a good feeling to have, because at the end of the day, you're still dealing with a breach. More importantly, and brand reputation and things that really aren't being covered by any monetary policy. So I'd rather look at this relationship more from let's avoid having you in the press entirely, versus a conversation about whether or not we feel like you're going to be filing a claim with us. I think it's a completely different dynamic in terms of how that relationship evolves, but it's a welcomed one, in my opinion, if I'm a CISO, because I've got someone that's assisting in evaluating whether or not my manufacturers are doing what they say they're doing, right, to some degree, and internally, is my organization doing what they are saying they're doing. Second set of eyes or a third set of eyes, I don't think ever is an unwelcome situation, from a CISO's perspective. because we're always understaffed and overworked. So now the conversation around how we do that at scale, obviously, it's my business challenge, but that's kind of what we're proposing to do in terms of disruption, in terms of how we think about risk, and then value add disruption in terms of how we want to change the relationship that we want to have with CISOs. And I think it's needed in the industry, whether we do it or whether it just is how the industry operates. I think I want to be in a position to be able to create that higher level of quality in the engagement, because I've been a CISO 5 times. I've painfully gone through many cybersecurity policies and gotten them only to forget about it, and it becomes somewhat of a shelfware investment I do every year when I have to renew my premium. In which, by the way, premiums are doubling or tripling because of the state of just where risk is and likelihood of breach. And so now CISOs are just seeing these bills just going up and up and up, and the value isn't really necessarily increasing in any capacity. So I think that's also requiring some level of change in the industry.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, for that. So I kind of in the same boat when I look at all those things. It seems like a lot of things start converging together, and you have cyber insurance, you have endpoint controls that companies are looking how to bring all those assurances that their controls working better than somebody else's. But at the end of the day, we're all trying to solve the same problem, and I believe it's a natural progression that where we're heading, that all those things are going to become interconnected and we can derive additional value outside of the primary focus on like cyber insurance, our primary focus for end controls. And there's also derivatives and added values that can be leveraged in others there. So one thing that I was thinking as far as a question came out, to the extent that you're comfortable answering, how does a case with Joe Sullivan and Uber, when Joe Sullivan was CISO and everyone knows he's getting sentenced right now or going through trial, how that affects cyber insurance, and how would that affect also CISOs when cyber insurance purchased? Or is there something that somebody is going to get covered by cyber insurance, or this case completely out of sort of focus or out of scope, and cyber insurance doesn't really care if something event like that happens and somebody is going to be liable or held liable for the event and potentially can have implications? Or should CISO hope for anything from cyber insurance, or this particular thing it's not really something that cyber insurance is going to deal with?
Yeah, I think there's really kind of two ways I look at that unfortunate situation that Joe finds himself into. I think the first is it sheds lights on liability of at individual executive levels, right? And we all know, I mean, maybe you don't know, but lots of executives, have DNO, director and officer insurance. They have individual because they're a fiduciary, right? So they've in some situations they can be held personally liable, for the events and behaviors that are occurring within that company. And so they get personal protection right through not necessarily cyber insurance, but DNO, director and officer insurance. And so
Mhm.
I do think that as a result of the situation that happened with Joe, I have been in a couple of CISA roundtables, and I would suspect that this becomes more and more an expectation as a term or as a condition of employment that said company provides me as the CISO of that company some personal liability protection, so that when you're in situations like want to avoid in a criminal or a civil matter, you're not necessarily paying out of pocket for your own defense. And so I think that's going to cause CISOs they should be thinking about their individual liabilities in companies and evaluating, what does that mean? Does that mean that I need to have DNO? Do I need to be a part of that DNO coverage that today most CISOs are not? I think that's one conversation. It's kind of adjacent to cyber, but it's somewhat related. But then the other one that is, I think, more in alignment to policies in cyber is um, behavioral, indicators, whether it's malicious or whether it's intentional behaviors that may or may not, invoke coverage or change the way coverage. We're seeing this at obviously nation state levels of acts of war, and redefinitions of what those terms look like in these cybersecurity policies, because we're seeing more and more, higher level systemic threats occurring, that's causing CISOs to want to evaluate the scope of their coverage. And I think on the flip side, I think insurance companies obviously need to start thinking about the operators of these kind of technologies, because they can become not necessarily putting a personal judgment on the situation of Joe, but the act of having leaders that can determine, the posture of your cybersecurity program. I need to be considered as well from the cybersecurity scoping of these policies. And so I think as a result, it'll probably put more scrutiny on individuals, not just technology, but more on the individuals themselves to determine, hey, are you in a good position to be able to objectively report threats to your company? I know a lot of CISOs who are kind of in a moral dilemma on ransomwares and payouts of hacker, white hat, gray hat. Do we pay the ransom or not? And to what extent do I need to be obligated to report that incident to a third party? And I think that fundamentally becomes something that cybersecurity policies might start to take on, right? Which is this idea of incident handling and crisis management, and making sure that there's a way that CISO is uh, feeling safe and protected in terms of being able to report the breach that's occurring, right? And I think that's kind of part of the situation we might find ourselves in is like, hey, we just protected and defended and paid out, a bounty, or we paid out, a ransomware, but no one may be obligated to report it. So I think there's a whole third conversation here, of course, to be had around this topic, which is what's the regulatory, what's the sector, position around reporting these things. And we're seeing that more and more, like with the GDPR and in privacy. You have no choice. Like within 24 hours, I think most of the time you have to report it to, some privacy office, regardless of whether or not you're obligated to report in a contractual manner. And that's, I think, where I would say that there's also needs to be some improvement on this in this area to help CISOs with their job, which is make it very difficult to have a conversation around whether you need to report it or not, and it just becomes mandatory. Reporting helps the industry, builds more transparency. I think ultimately improves the way we think about hygiene and reflecting on it. Because, as you know, for every breach we see in Verizon breach report, or every forensics report, there's probably 17 a 7x unreported amount of incidences that we just don't see because it's not being reported. And I think that's where cybersecurity policies will start to probably weigh in on, hey, you need to let us know. You need to, we need to, we're a partner. We need to be able to communicate. We have forensics. We have retainers. Like, we want to assist on these things. Just like when I have a car incident, we're in a position where we might say, do we file a claim, or do we just repair it on ourselves? Like, just fix it ourselves. Kind of creates that type of situation.
Well, that's kind of thank you, Paul, for that. And what you ended with is kind of interesting conversation too. Is like coming out of all this case with Joe Sullivan and Uber, there are a lot of regulations on the table, and some of them they go in and put in all this, I would say, big measures in place that everyone has to report essentially everything when something moves or something doesn't move, and then it becomes essentially a nightmare for CISOs to manage all those things. And
Yes.
who's in an organization supposed to take responsibility? And when I looked at what your organization is capable of assisting companies with, it conversation becomes at the end of the day, it's like, okay, when is a case that we're supposed to report, or where we can just take care of our own business and say, well, look, I have clients and I know what they want, and I know that they want to be protected and feel safe and secure with my organization. I had a problem, I'll deal directly with the customers without involving insurance or anyone else, and I'll take care of the business. And I may anonymously share information that I had a problem within my organization with the community, so they can prevent themselves from the same situation occurring in their organization. So it's kind of like dicey situation that organizations have to face right now because of this reporting. And it also doesn't help when you start report and somebody is reading all those reports and they say, "Oh, check this out! It's a new exploit was unleashed against this company. Let me try this exploit against somebody else."
Right.
So, what's your take on that? And
I think generally reporting. I mean, there's definitely a burden of reporting, right? That becomes difficult to manage. I think it providing some standards and regulations to assist in determining that maybe can help offset the burden of whether or not you do. And so I think that's kind of one aspect. I don't know many adversaries who look at breach, and CDE disclosures as the first way they understand, competitively your defenses. So I'm always more inclined to say that most adversaries know more about your network than you do, and so disclosing. And you got to kind of joke sometimes with CISOs who keep things a little bit close to the vest. I get it. I've again been a CISO many times, but if someone's very motivated to understand what technology stack they're looking at, jobs, they're looking at LinkedIn, they're looking at OSINT, they pretty much understand everything about what you're owning, technology wise, and things like that. And so um, generally, I don't think necessarily that information is that being disclosed is probably going to open organizations up to more types of attacks. I think they already understand it. That's why they're attacking in the first place. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on that.
got it. Thank you. So, I think we're coming up to the closure here. So, I'd like to wrap our conversation with something exciting and funny per se. So, from your experience being a CISO and running in cyber insurance right now, do you have any anecdotal cases that you would be able to share to put a chuckle on our audience?
So in my current startup, we're not we launched February 1st, so we don't have any like war stories yet or interesting situations, um, to share. But I think just in my times as being a CISO, the thing that I think is interesting, like one story that I always find pretty interesting to share is one where we set up these anti-phishing controls, and we were able to block the attacks, but we were able to let the end users click, ineffectively click on communication. So we knew who would have been potentially targeted or susceptible, and we had engineers, and these are in like top secret, very sensitive network, scenarios. So think like military defense type setting. We had engineers clicking like every 3 seconds on these links, trying to get these links to work. So we, call the ones that were just kind of egregiously, clicking these things, let the rest just kind of go away. And the engineers said to me, hey, I'm an engineer. It's my job to like click on things, and I read everything, and it was just quite. As part of my career, it was a quite a memorable time when I just started to realize just the difference between user awareness and culture, and just how difficult it is to really have human behavior, improve simply by declaring a policy and a behavior as a desired state. So at that point in my career, I never necessarily ever in my cybersecurity programs create a control that is simply about awareness or simply about behavior. Those are good hygiene, right? I don't want to necessarily put a ding on anyone's security awareness programs or anti-phishing programs and all that stuff. I think it's all good, but I never rely on that to become the only control in terms of likelihood of residual risk. So that's just a story, like a story to share of just like my observation, and I guess my cynicism towards people is they're going to do things that you don't expect them to do. It kind of gets to that assumed compromise kind of mindset, is a better defense strategy than assume everyone is going to have good intentions and everyone's going to do what you expect them to do. It's just not scalable. So that's my story.
Yeah, it happens. I heard similar stories too. So sometimes it's human behavior, the hardest thing to change, and the expectations we have and what we observe in the field, it's completely different. And we have to.
Yeah, I'll give you an example of like large scale like analysis of human behavior. There's about these social media sites get breached, new passwords get dumped all the time, but they did some average password. There's some science on the password dumps. Like about 10 years ago, the average, like most common password was password, like just the word password, right? Not a shock. And this was probably about 15 years ago by now. And then there's been some more recent ones, probably within the last 2 or 3 years, bigger dumps, newer data sets. Most common password, a year ago was password one. So in 15 years of cybersecurity awareness and consumer, understanding of like cyber and hygiene, we've gone from password to password one. So again, I don't have a lot of confidence that we're going to get to like password one exclamation mark, anytime soon. And of course, we all know that that's not a strong end state. And so I always find that type of stuff very fascinating in terms of just the behavioral side of our jobs and just
Yeah.
how challenging it is to be a CISO because we have to understand the technology and to some degree consider the human behavior because that it's like the Great Wall of China. They built it right to protect against the Mongolians and whatnot, and it was never really breached by war. It was simply just you know they bribed guards, and the guards would open the gates, and people just walk right through. Right? Armies would walk right through. It's kind of like that, just that mindset of like, okay, the people
Yeah.
factor. They built these walls, right? Talk about an infrastructure. Talk about a physical wall. That would have cost trillions of dollars nowadays to build, and it was defeated by just simply asking someone to open the doors. Right? That's the
Yep.
kind of stuff we have to think about, and not lose sight of in our jobs day to day.
Exactly. All right. Thank you, Paul, for sharing that, and thank you for coming on the show with me
Yeah, my
and
pleasure.
having a discussion about cybersecurity. It's certainly been a pleasure having you. So, if you have any final words with the audience to share,
No, just if you're in the United States, happy holidays, and stay warm. I'm in Minneapolis, so start the day
all right. Thank
with
you.
ice. Yeah,
And to
cheers.
everyone else out there, thank you for coming on and listening and watching us. So, just remember, we're stronger together. And until next time, thank you.